Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Adam Smith Institute webinar. I'm Morgan Schondelmeier, the Head of External Affairs at the ASI, and I'm honored to be bringing you another webinar, this time a discussion surrounding the government's police crime and sentencing bill, which is currently passing through Parliament. The bill covers a wide range of reforms, including stronger sentences, increased police powers with regards to protest, and additional recourse for police activities surrounding the prevention, investigation, and prosecution of crime. It has not been free of controversy. Many detractors claim that the bill presents threats to human rights, increases subjective police power, and decreases accountability. And all this is against the backdrop of a national conversation about the safety of our streets, violence against women and girls, and incidences of heavy-handed policing of protests. Here with me to discuss the bill and its political and societal implications are Hannah Al-Othman of the Sunday Times. She formerly worked for BuzzFeed News as a political reporter, as well as for the Mail Online, Daily Mirror, and Evening Standard. She has a law degree, 2 media law qualifications, and a separate qualification in court reporting. Sam Ashworth-Hayes is a freelance journalist and economist. He's written for The Spectator, CapX, Unheard, The New European, and many more. He also featured at the ASI's annual Forum conference, where he gave a talk entitled Stronger Sentences, Safer Streets. And Anita Boateng, who is a former government special advisor. Anita completed several spells as special advisor in various departments, including but not limited to the Department of Work and Pensions, the Cabinet Office, and the Ministry of Justice. Before her work as a SPAD, she was a political producer for BBC Question Time and a senior researcher in the Policy Research Unit. I'd like to start with brief introductory remarks from my guests before we move into a chaired discussion and finish with audience Q&A. So please be sure to submit your questions for our panel via the Q&A function below, and I'll ask Hannah to join us first.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me. I'll sort of launch straight into it. I'll try and keep it fairly brief. But yeah, this is, the first thing I'd say is this is a huge piece of legislation. You know, we've got over 300 pages and there's just a lot in there. My thoughts looking at it is a lot of it is quite reactionary. It's quite knee-jerk. There's some good stuff in there that that people have been calling for a long time, campaigners, politicians, things like increased sentences for driving offences. But then some of it just feels very much like the government is trying to respond quite quickly to public pressure, to media pressure, without necessarily really thinking it through and taking the time to consider it. So you have these quite arbitrary 10-year sentences, which seems to be a figure just sort of plucked out of the air. And we've ended up in this situation whereby, you can get a longer sentence for attacking a statue than you can for attacking a person. And similarly, the protest, the sort of protest legislation that is in this bill, the government's been quite open in that is a response to the Extinction Rebellion protests. But again, this is something that's been quite media-led, quite public opinion-led. And now you're in the position where the public are almost taking the opposite view when they've seen what happened at the protest in Clapham this weekend. They thought this was what they wanted, these crackdowns on protests, and now they're like, oh no, actually that's not what we wanted at all. And there's now this reaction to the bill, which basically I think shows the dangers of reacting in this way with parliamentary legislation without taking time to fully consider it. And then just the final point I'd make is a lot of the things that's being sold at the moment, is sort of tougher sentences for rapists and that kind of thing in the context of the current conversation around violence against women. But I have to say, and I'm not the only person saying this, I think you'll find it lots of lawyers and experts, far more expert than me, saying the same. But tougher sentences is not really, that on its own is not what is going to help. When you've got such huge backlogs in the criminal justice system, you've got cuts to the CPS, to policing, to courts, so that rapists aren't actually getting to court. So just introducing longer sentences, that's not really what's needed. And again, it feels like quite a populist response to that. So I mean, those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you. One of a few things that you touched on that I know that we'll get back to, because I have questions prepared along those lines, but it's this bill, a lot of it, I think probably the most controversial part right now, given, like you said, the response to the protests in Clapham, is it was built off of the failure of policing of the Extinction Rebellion protests. There were clear holes in the legislation that allowed the police to act on these acts of civil disobedience. Do you feel like this is an overreaction? Like you said, that Londoners were upset at the Extinction Rebellion protests disrupting their daily lives, but now that we're implementing legislation which allows the police to use almost subjective judgment for what is disruption, do we feel like this is an overreaction?
It feels, I mean, the government have gone out of their way to say that it's not, it's not going to hinder human rights, and it's not all the things that the detractors are saying it is. But, things like imposing noise restrictions, protests are not meant to be undisruptive. That, by their very nature, protests are meant to cause inconvenience. So, and the challenge is, I mean, there is the potential that this will get tested in court, because there do appear to be these sort of legal points that may end up being conflicted. So the right to freedom of expression with these laws, but that can take years and years and years. And the other thing I'd say is, the government has said that it's been working quite closely with the police on this, with Cressida Dick, and she said about the holes in the legislation, but you'd question, like, is it just the police that they need to be working with on this, or is it also human rights groups? Have they had those conversations both ways? Because is that really a fair approach to take? If not,
yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the loudest response we've seen have been those human rights organizations like Liberty and Big Brother Watch. Thank you for those introductory statements. I'm going to move on to Sam's intro, and then we will, like I said, bring everyone back for a larger discussion. So let's get Sam up here. Hi, Sam. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, as Hannah said, it's an absolutely massive piece of legislation with lots of tinkering around the edges. So, I mean, we're not going to get anywhere close to a comprehensive discussion. But before I kind of dig into some of the rest of it, I did quite like the measure, sort of changing the definition of careless driving for trained police pursuit officers, because that has been a problem for quite a long time, exposing to unnecessary and unfair legal risk. But yeah, as with most pieces of legislation, you can kind of split this bill into substantive changes and headline-seeking window dressing. And while the change around the damage to memorials and statues has got a lot of attention, I don't think it's actually very important. There's been a lot of discussion about people getting 10-year sentences for damaging a statue, but I think realistically that's just not going to happen. The current state of law, as I understand it, is that if you were to do more than £5,000 worth of criminal damage to one of these objects, then you'd be facing potentially a 10-year jail sentence anyway. All this really does is remove that £5,000 of material damage threshold. And if you actually look at the government impact assessment, they basically don't think it's going to take up any more room in prison than the current measures already do. So I think it's a bad change in that it's the introduction of a law which is almost there not to be used, and that introduces an element of arbitrariness into the system which shouldn't be there. But I don't think it's quite as bad as people have said it would be. The substantive changes in the bill, I think, are more useful. And obviously, I am coming at this with my own particular philosophy. And as Morgan said, you can see my talk at the forum for more details on this. But the very short version of this is that I think incapacitation is generally more useful than deterrence. And this bill does introduce some measures to assist with this. I really thought the introduction of serious violence reduction orders is a good move. This is for offenders who have used a weapon in an offence previously, and it allows the police to basically stop and challenge them without cause to try and catch people who are still carrying knives, still presenting a threat to the community around them. The other elements in the bill are sort of making for stronger minimum sentencing requirements, making it harder for courts to ignore these where they are in place, and also ensuring that people serve out sort of longer parts of their sentences before they're eligible for release. Which again, I think is probably a good move when you look at the sort of category of sort of violent offenders who these changes are being applied. I do think one measure kind of falls into the overlap between substantive and sort of attention seeking, and that's as Hannah kind of indicated, the changes to protests. I think it's reasonable to introduce a change in the law in response to a change in tactics, and the idea that protests can kind of just scale up and become ever more disruptive to people living their lives, I think is not really a starter. The right to free expression, the right to free speech are some things that you have to balance against your obligations to the people around you in society, and in particular, the obligation not to actively interfere with their rights. So I think imposing conditions on protests and potentially when they get seriously out of hand, having some measures to crack down on them, I think is a useful step. I would say that I'm not totally comfortable with how this law has been drafted though, because the clause 59 in particular, whereby causing serious annoyance to your fellow citizens is enough to take you in scope for the powers, I think is probably a little excessive. But I think in a sense, it kind of gets away from what has been the major problem over the last year or so, and particularly looking at the vigil over the last weekend, which is that people don't really know what to expect from the police. The breakup of the vigil was obviously excessive, and probably shouldn't have happened in the way it did, particularly given the way protests were treated last summer when they were considerably rowdier. So I think there's sort of a limit to what you can do in legislation if you aren't going to be policing it consistently. That's my sort of brief summary of the bill so far.
Thank you so much. You guys are really good at steering the discussion towards my questions, so thank you. Clause 59, which you mentioned, one of the things that it does is it removes the current common law kind of measures for policing public nuisance to a statutory offense. So basically, the reason why people weren't being arrested or sentenced, I should say, for causing public nuisance is because the common law didn't set that as a precedent. So now it's going to be a statutory offense on a case-by-case basis. Do you think this is the right way to deal with this, or is this kind of going in the legislation flying in the face of years of judicial rulings?
I don't object to changing the law by putting it on a statutory basis. I think in a sense you do have to respond to the state of society as you see it as well. And if as you say, if protests are becoming more disruptive as a tactic, then it makes sense for the law to change in response to that. I think it's more a question of degree rather than of the action itself. And I think the Lord Hoffman case, comments on civil disobedience is quite useful in that the kind of current status is that everyone sort of accepts that there will be some disruption caused, there'll be some misbehavior, and the protesters will then face the consequences of the law, which are predictable and reasonable, as sort of a way of signaling their sincerity in putting forward these beliefs. Taking sort of the enforcement of policing around protests too far would be a mistake, and I would prefer to see clause 59 changed, but otherwise I think it's a fairly good move.
Great, thank you. I think we'll now bring in Anita for our last intro, and then we will bring everyone back. Hi, Anita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'll leave it to you for our intro statements.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the politics of this, both in respect of the Conservative Party and about the Labour Party, because I think, as both the panelists have said, like, this is a huge bill, and so there's so much in here that is doing sort of very different tasks for the government and for the Conservative Party. But let me start by saying, I think Hannah mentioned that a lot of the sentencing felt arbitrary. Sam talked about some of these, again about the arbitrary nature of some of this legislation. And I guess what I would say to that is there is very much a sort of mishmash of different forces being exerted within the political spectrum that is affecting what's in the legislation. So the first point then for us to establish is exactly what the government is trying to achieve. And I think the reason why so much of this may feel arbitrary or feel like they're throwing out legislation, putting things onto statute that may not actually make a difference. Sam talked about the sentencing around memorials, for instance. So this is really about signaling. This is about the government saying this is behavior that we do not like, and we are going to show the public that we're on their side when it comes to making communities safer. And so the purpose of this bill is to really resonate with a lot of socially conservative voters for whom crime has been growing in terms of political salience over the past 5 years. And so they cannot imagine a scenario where they're going to see objections to, tougher sentences for sex offenders or for people that assault emergency workers. And indeed, on some of those issues, it's actually been Labour politicians that have campaigned and wanted to seem tougher on that matter. So we're going to go on to talk about protests, but we cannot deny that this legislation is starting its journey at a really challenging time in the Commons politically, partly because of the way that the vigil for Sarah Everard was policed, if we can call it that, but also because of the issues around coronavirus laws. I mean, these actions that the police undertook are entangled in a much broader row about whether the government is actually trying to restrict the right to protest more generally. And that's hitting up against the views of some backbenchers, conservative backbenchers, who have concerns about the broad scope of government powers and the way they've been used over the past year. So I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I guess the thing to note is that the Conservatives might find some unusual allies with backbenchers with that broader concern about heavy-handed policing or about police powers. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that this bill isn't just about protest, and it isn't just about signalling, the Conservatives are quote unquote tough on crime. I think there's also some really interesting stuff happening within the justice space. So for instance, this won't be the focus of political debate, but problem courts is something that finds its way into this legislation. And I think you can see there how this legislation started in the Ministry of Justice. So problem courts are basically a way of bringing judges in and kind of solving problems for individuals around reoffending. They're thought to be very effective around mental health courts and adult drug use. And the purpose is really to kind of bring together lots of different tools to make sure the judge is involved in ways to make sure that we actually tackle reoffending. So I think there's lots of tough rhetoric, but actually some of that if that was brought in as a result of this legislation, I think that would be the government taking a very different approach to addressing reoffending. That's not just about ratcheting up sentencing. So I just want to finally end by talking a little bit more about the broader challenge and the broader theme, I guess, of this bill. And that's really about, I kind of see the parallels between this and almost the kind of welfare debates that were going on in the House of Commons in the Cameron years between 2010 and 2015. It's really about the government is finding ways to put the Labour Party in quite an awkward position, because Labour at the moment is saying that it opposes the government, it's going to stand against this bill, but it is supportive of the government's broader, tougher on crime approach. And it sort of, Labour is in a position where it can't really figure out whether it's attacking the government from the right or from the left. So, for instance, you had Jess Phillips, who's one of the opposition ministers on domestic violence, saying, well, actually, this bill needs more laws against sexual harassment. And then on the other side, you have David Lammy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, saying that actually that we have to oppose this bill because it is illiberal in terms of its approach to protest. So I think that Labour's found a technical reason why it doesn't like this bill, which is the protest issue. But the broader pain about how it shows itself to be resonating with those socially conservative voters that are thought to exist pretty much only in the red wall, which is not true, but that's beside the point. That issue of being able to resonate with those voters who want to see a tough on crime message, and the challenge that they have to stand up for some of the other voters that stayed with them in 2019 that may be more concerned about broader sweeping powers for the police is not going to go away. So I think we may see a number of these types of bills working their way through Parliament to enable the Conservative to make the point to those more socially conservative voters that were formerly Labour, that's really the Conservatives that are on their side.
That is such a good assessment. And you said one thing that was particularly poignant, which you said that the political attention on crime is increasing, but crime itself is decreasing. Crime has been decreasing steadily since 1995. So is this something that is a reflection of just larger social conservative attitudes that we're seeing are gaining prevalence again, which, as you mentioned, is a problem or a target for both parties?
No, it's a very good question. And I think almost the best answer to it is possibly to refight the austerity years. I think that what we are seeing is, and I think this is not unusual actually, that when crime is decreasing, that doesn't necessarily correlate to anxiety about crime and safety. And I think that idea of safety is one, like many political issues, that's not about actually incidents that you will have seen or experienced. And it kind of resonates with broader anxieties. And I think that this is a moment of grave uncertainty for the country, not just in terms of COVID, but in terms of like the impact of the financial crash, the fact that we're seeing, I'm a local councillor, struggles in terms of local council and financing. All of those themes do kind of come together and create a kind of confluence of anxiety, which is being tapped into. And so I think that you're absolutely right to say that it's not really about the numbers, but I think the kind of the reason why it mattered, for instance, in 2017, was that Jeremy Corbyn came out and said, the reason why the Conservative Party, the reason why we've had terror attacks, all of that is because there's been cuts in police numbers. And that feeling of seeing a policeman on the street, for instance, is something that, again, it serves to underline that point about safety, which isn't necessarily about whether the police is actually doing something in that moment to stop crime. So it's interesting and a broader question about why we are so anxious at the moment. But I think it's undeniable that the level of uncertainty that we're seeing within our lives is partly feeding this broader concern about crime. And that's why I think this is going to be and has been quite a big battleground for the past two elections, and I think could be a big battleground for the next election.
Great. Well, thank you. On that note, we'll bring everyone else back in. And I have a few questions for each of you, and then we'll get some questions from our audience. Oh, sorry, I'm just bringing Sam back in. Let's get this video started. There we go. Okay, we are all here. So, like you all said, this is a huge piece of legislation. We have a lot to talk about, but let's start with some of the blowback on the bill around protests, and then we can kind of maybe either get that out of the way, or that's going to be a main issue here. So as Hannah mentioned in her opening statements, a lot of these human rights organizations are pitting this as a fundamental threat to our human right to protest. And as Anita mentioned, I think that is heavily related to coronavirus and the over-policing of coronavirus and a lot of maybe misguided or subjective police decisions around coronavirus. Do we think that this is kind of a temporary focus on protesting as a human right, or do we think that fundamentally we are deciding that this is something that we are worried is going to be cracked down on in the long term? I open that to everyone. Anyone?
I'd just say I think what's really interesting about this sort of moment in time surrounding this bill is I feel like throughout coronavirus, on the whole, the public have been very accepting of their civil liberties being curtailed. So things that, you know, sort of 18 months ago would have just felt, you know, sort of things like who you can have in your own garden and the police being able to fine you for that. And, you know, the public have seemed to just accept all of this. And I think it's quite interesting that there is this limit whereby people are saying, oh, actually, no, you know, we're not just going to accept everything. And there is sort of a lot of dissent around the protests being cracked down on. I think, you know, I think that that's partly why this is such a problem for the Met, because I mean, you know, this legislation is going to pass. The government's got a huge majority, but you know, that it was going in their favour until now, and then they've basically had this crisis of public confidence. So, you know, this legislation was sneaking through under the radar, essentially, and you know, it's really those actions of Saturday night that have made people pay attention. I don't know is the answer in the long term. I don't know what the pandemic will change and you know, how people's attitudes will shift going forward. But that was just one observation that I had that I thought might be worth making.
Yeah. Can I just jump in? Sorry. I just wanted to say that it's interesting that we're talking about people's perceptions of the protests as well, because there were polling was done that said that majority of people thought that the protests shouldn't go, or the vigil shouldn't go ahead, and the Met were right to shut it down. So is this like a Westminster thing that we're having here? We're talking about protests from a like policy kind of insider standpoint, when the majority of the country thinks that these regulations are truly in place for our safety, and we can put our right to protest on hold for now.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly what I was going to say. And I think there's some really good YouGov polling. It showed that 43% thought that the police should not have allowed the vigil to go ahead. And I think it's a really fascinating moment of reckoning. And there's a reason why I said this was an awkward moment for the government politically in the Commons. I don't think this is an awkward moment for the government in the nation. And I think it's really important to make that distinction. And I think that one of the things that's really been mischaracterized about the British psyche is this notion that we are sort of obsessed with freedom. And I mean, I guess maybe I am, but I don't think actually the majority of the public is. And I think this idea of like the Blitz spirit and personal sacrifice, and actually a very obedient country. We love to queue. I mean, I think that these themes and this approach actually is much more powerful than the instinct to rebel. And I actually think that we have this idea that British people in general quite like protests. They don't. I mean, so you mentioned I mentioned the YouGov polling about the vigil, but this protest goes back to Black Lives Matter. The majority felt that the Black Lives Matter protests had a negative impact. You know, Occupy London wasn't supported by the majority, and you know, the big one, Extinction Rebellion. YouGov polling back in October of 2019 found that like 60% of people had more sympathy with the people on the train that dragged those Extinction Rebellion protesters off the roof than they did with the people protesting. And that really was the reason why the government brought in this legislation about protesting. Now, I will make the point that it is very broadly drawn. This idea of like annoyance or inconvenience allows for a lot of scope and a lot of discretion from police about how they judge that. And that is, I think, the broader concern. But I don't think the public is concerned about that.
Yeah, I agree with what Lisa says. I mean, looking at YouGov polling sort of more broadly, people are pretty strongly against even quite, they're very strongly against serious disruption caused by protests, and they're quite strongly against even minor inconvenience. So I think the idea that this is a public outcry against restrictions on protest is probably incorrect. I think it's more a sort of NGO and activist outcry. So the usual segments of civil society who sort of complain about these things.
I think that's probably right. It's a minority making a lot of noise, maybe, which again is probably why it's going to pass with flying colors. We're not going to see much of a rebellion tonight, but we'll get to that later. Sam, so mentioned it earlier, your philosophy on sentencing is essentially longer sentences, nicer prisons. So you think that there's a combination there where we need to fund our system better, fund our judicial system, our prisons better, provide more mental health support for prisoners. But you still think that sentences should be long. What does this bill do along those lines, and what would you like to see in the future?
Yeah, so it does. It has been accused of sentence inflation by the back door, which obviously I think is a good thing, with sort of longer periods before people are eligible for release if they've committed certain violent and sexual offences, and stricter rules on the enforcement of minimum sentencing. But as you say, it really kind of only addresses the one side of this, which is making sure that the sentences are kind of commensurate to the crime and sort of increasing the ability to take people out of circulation when they're deemed to be a risk to the public. The flip side of that is that we really do need to put more money into the prison system and also the court and court system and policing, because even though the deterrent effect of these rules isn't particularly large, what does seem to work is having people, police officers on the beat if you want to sort of reduce crime at source. I think at the moment we have 132,000 police officers in England and Wales. Back in 2010, we had 144,000. So we've had, the population has grown and the number of officers has decreased. So the police are significantly overworked. And I think at the moment, the Metropolitan Police's policy is pretty much, no CCTV and then probably no investigation. So, I mean, and also when you sort of look at crime data, it's worth sort of taking this into account as well, because people do, violence against a person has been increasing. So that might be partly why we're getting this focus on crime at the moment. But people do also only really tend to come forward and report crime when they think there's a reasonable prospect of it being resolved. So obviously you have the ONS crime survey, which is kind of which is sort of independent of that, but certainly police crime figures are subject to that effect. And we also have ridiculous court backlogs as well. So the stronger sentences is a really good move towards taking people who are likely to reoffend out of circulation. But for this to work, you have to get them through the criminal justice system in the first place. I think last year about 7% of crimes eventually resulted in charges being brought, and in 2015 it was 16%. So this system is just running at well beyond its capacity at the moment. And as you say, I would also like to see some measures made to improve prisons. The idea that you incapacitate a prisoner by taking them out of circulation is one thing, but brutalizing them is something else entirely. The punishment you face when you go to prison is the restriction of your liberty. It's not supposed to be a sort of a dangerous or unsafe environment. I think last year there were 83,000 people in prison in England and Wales, and the system had room for about 75,000, so the cells are overcrowded. Self-harm is at record highs. There are prisoner-on-prisoner assaults running very high. There are sorts of stuff. And so having these conditions doesn't increase the deterrent effect of prisons. It certainly doesn't make someone more likely to be rehabilitated. So I kind of guess that what I would like to see once this bill has passed is further measures to kind of increase funding to other parts of the criminal justice system.
One thing that you mentioned is people are not very likely to bring their case forward if they don't think that there's any likelihood of it being solved. And anecdotally, this is very true for women who are victims of sexual violence, which of course has been a topic of the week. So what can we do either legislatively, culturally, through the justice system to ensure that these cases are prosecuted? And I open that to everyone.
I just, sort of agree with what Sam says, is that I think the number one thing is to fund the system. That's what's going to work. Because, you mentioned that crime has been falling, but I actually think reporting of crime has also been falling. So I think that issue is masked quite a lot. But, there's a real lack of confidence with these sorts of cases in the criminal justice system. And, there's a reason for that. It's because cases just aren't getting to court, and they're not, or, if they are, they're not getting to court in a timely manner. And I think, rather than seeing the rapist if it was a question of which is the most important, rather than it being have their rapist have 12 months extra on their sentence, it would be getting the rapist to court in the first place. And really that there have been cuts to frontline policing, to the CPS to courts, basically just right across the criminal justice system. And I'd say that that's one of the main things to tackle this issue. But that is something that the government can sort of tangibly do. It can choose to fund that. The other thing is societal, and that is a lot longer. And that's about changing attitudes. That's about not normalizing a sort of sexist banter, misogyny, and that starts right from a young age, right through the education system. I think that involves men calling each other out on that, but that's a lot harder for the government to enact change on. But if we're asking for policy making, I think that has to focus on the criminal justice system and not just sentencing.
I have one final question for the panelists. Oh, Anita,
I just wanted to add two things to the interesting contributions from Sam and Hannah there. On the question of funding, I think that actually this conversation about funding, particularly for the MOJ, which funds courts and prisons, is not going away. You will have seen in the budget that the Chancellor is planning for a difficult spending round in the autumn, where departments will be asked to find a significant number of cuts. And this is after a year where the court system in particular has been under quite a lot of pressure. And I suspect, I mean, maybe it won't come immediately, but I suspect that some of those reductions in spending envelopes that have been baked in right now may need and may require a rethink over the next couple of years. And on the point about rape in particular, actually, I did want to agree with Hannah that really what we are dealing with is a question around how smooth and how easy are prosecutions, but actually the broader issue around how we as society respond is quite key. I mean, I remember I was on a jury for a rape case and the person got acquitted. I won't say much about it, but essentially, partly just because of the views of the jurors who had an astounding approach to which basically narrows down to why didn't she run and why didn't she scream type stuff, which is all about like how women ought to behave in these scenarios. And I think that there's nothing you can do if that is the views of a jury pool. And actually, I think the second point is that actually I almost worried that, particularly for Labour, who should have a more nuanced understanding of this, to kind of come in and say, well, the problem is sentences aren't high enough. I worry that sometimes sentences on these particular issues where they're not well understood serves as a deterrent to jurors who don't want to give someone 8 years for something and therefore go, well, probably didn't mean the worst of it, let's let it go. And so I do think that it's weird that the whole conversation about this bill and about policing in general, as well as about courts, has become a question of money and not what does good policing look like? What does good sentencing look like? What does a good court system look like? And I understand why there's not as much room for the government to do that because it's facing so much cost pressure. But it's funny that actually Labour hasn't seen that opening and hasn't been trying to get a conversation going about how to do things better, not just about nuts and money and sentencing years.
On the point about Labour kind of capitalizing, maybe isn't the right word, but working to find solutions that work for their party as well. If the legislation is going to pass, which we know it will, could Labour have worked with backbench Liberal Tories more to kind of find common ground against this bill instead of just flat out saying we're not having it? Could there have been more room for cooperation to create some aims that work better for both parties?
Yeah, I mean, I don't rule out the possibility that there is an amendment in the Lords, not from Labour in particular, but there isn't an amendment in the Lords that specifically addresses some of the broader concerns from the Conservative backbenchers in particular, that ends up either, getting the government to think again about some elements of it. And I think it's particularly, for me, this point about whether the presumption in favour of maintaining protest, even when that right gets abused, which I think is a Steve Baker point that he was making, whether there's something that gets at that notion ends up finding its way into the bill just to reinforce that particular point. I don't think that Labour is too trapped in being opportunistic in respect of this and a number of other issues, where they went from being like, we'll abstain because this is awkward and we don't want to look like we don't like sentencing, to, oh no, haha, we've got a reason, we have to go stronger to make the point about protests. It all looks a little too opportunistic, I think, for them to be able to form an alliance on any of these measures. And again, I don't think they're really engaging with the substance of the bill beyond this protest point, which makes it again quite difficult for them to really find common ground.
I think the problem for Labour is they've kind of inherited a problem that the Lib Dems have had for a while, which is they're trying to be all things to all people. So, you know, they're trying to appeal to their metropolitan liberal city living voters and saying, actually, you know, who will care about this protest issue and say, you know, we want people to be allowed to do that on Clapham Common. But then they also need to appeal to their voters in their sort of traditional heartlands who they're losing, who will want the tough on crime rhetoric, who, you know, that will appeal to them. And I think that, you know, I think that will be the more enduring election issue more than the protest issue. I think really, you know, if they're being cynical and if they're playing politics, that's something that maybe Labour should be bearing in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't say though I wouldn't quite cast it as Labour being sort of torn between two large voting blocks. So I mean, the solid majority of the country is kind of in favour of these, or in favour of the view that the protest went too far. I think it's more that it's internal party management, and they've got this sort of slightly out of touch sitting group of MPs and activists that they kind of have to appease. Although I wouldn't personally have opted to do it in this way. The primary function of the state is to maintain the rule of law. Fundamentally, you know, voters want their bins emptied and they want the criminals locked away so they can sort of go about their lives in sort of safety and security. So when people sort of ask, is this, can Labour would Labour sort of deter some of their voters by voting with this bill, by offering to vote for it with amendments? I kind of think it's almost in the wrong way. Is that I think they could probably put off quite a few voters by sort of voting against it. But,
well, I think I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience. We have quite a few. I'm trying not to get too distracted looking through them. But first, one question that I wanted to bring up is this new announcement, I think it was yesterday or today, of measures aimed at targeting violence against women and girls. So this, to me, seems a little bit like a back of the napkin sort of policy. We have things like extra money for CCTV and streetlights, and things like plainclothes officers patrolling Soho and going into pubs and bars. Is this PR for this larger bill to kind of say, look at all the work we're doing on crime and justice as a whole? Or do we think that the government's actually deciding that they need to kind of target this as a specific issue?
I would say it's another, you know, this is another set of reactionary things. And I'm not saying that some of them are not good ideas. I mean, I think cuts to things like street lighting have been an issue, but I think this needs, you know, this feels like a real watershed moment. This is something that women have been saying for a long time, that this is a really serious issue, and it feels like it hasn't been taken seriously. I think they reopened the consultation on this, the government, and they've had 78,000 additional responses, and that was as of this morning, which I think is really good. But I think, you know, what we really need is to not just, as you say, come up with these you know, sort of hastily drawn up back of a napkin measures, but really, you know, think and take the time and take this as a moment, and you know, something that's not going away, that's something that's been an issue for a while, but actually I think it requires a more considered response.
Let's see if we can bring in some questions from the audience. Connor asks a question that I identify with as an American. He says, what does the panel think about the practice that some US states have of a 3-strike rule? Commit 3 crimes of a certain nature and you're locked up for the rest of your life. Do we think that's proportionate? Do we think that's helpful? Sam, I think you might have some thoughts on that particularly. You talk a lot about recidivism rates and trying to decrease repeat offenses. Does something like that help?
I mean, I'm sort of opposed to the free strike policy in that I view it as being overly inflexible. In terms of incapacitation and sort of taking people out of circulation, for the most part, what you're almost waiting to do is for certain repeat offenders to basically age out of it, to grow up and calm down. And so the idea that you would keep someone, in their 50s, 60s, 70s locked up for something they did in their sort of teens, 20s is often going to be counterproductive, particularly as well in with the nature of US free strike laws, where they can be almost arbitrary in their application, in that sort of three quite low-level offences can add up to a very, very long sentence that one more serious crime might not.
Yeah.
And I'm just, I guess, funny thing to throw in there is that we had a similar thing for like burglary in particular. It wasn't particularly effective because part of this is actually about what judges will do. And I think that I'm not sure it would have the intended consequence. And I think the evidence around free strike rules as a deterrent is not compelling.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
No, I was going to say what matters is what works. And I don't think it doesn't seem there's much evidence to show that it does.
Exactly. Yeah. When it does work, it works through incapacitation rather than deterrence. And actually, this bill we're discussing at the moment does try to strengthen the existing sort of free strike system in the UK by removing, not removing, but limiting the sort of the circumstance under which judges can deviate from it. But I think, as you say, like whether they'll be willing to actually stick with it is another thing entirely.
Okay, so we have a question from William. Do MPs as legislators overstate the importance of new laws as opposed to appropriately resourcing the ability of police, courts, and prisons to implement those already on the statute books?
I really have to take this question as a former advisor to a minister who had a nuanced view on this, David Lidington, who was the Lord Chancellor in 2017. Yes, but I think the reason why it matters is because of the signal it sends to judges, and that's really what sentencing is about. It basically says if you introduce a new law that, for instance, makes, and this is a real example, you can get up to 5 years for harming an animal, then there may not be a lot of people that are going to get 5 years for that kind of sentence. But a judge might look at that and go, well, if I'm going to give up to 5 years to doing this, then if someone's done something completely different, I can't give them less time than that. So it has an impact on the way that judges sentence more than anything else. But I agree with if the implication of the panel's question was that actually it requires if you want to make a difference to the way that society behaves, it requires not just a debate about sentencing, but one about the way the CPS behaves and the way the court system works and the way that policing works and all of that together.
Any follow-up to that, or shall I pick another question? Let's see. It seems we are being bombarded weekly with cybercrime of one sort or another, whether that's internal or external, that we didn't have before. This is a new challenge. Is this covered in the bill? Will we be seeing further legislation on cybercrime? The government did release details of their larger defense plan, which included a lot of anti-cyber terrorism and cybercrime measures. But what about on a smaller scale, like identity theft or something like that? Is this a problem that the government is looking to tackle?
I think it's a really good point. And when we talk about policing resourcing, we never actually discuss what we want those police to do. So do we want them on the streets, policing by consent? Do we want them breaking up protests? Do we want them tackling cybercrime? And I think that cybercrime is something that a lot of people experience, not many report, I presume, because I've never heard anecdotally of anyone reporting cybercrime. So I do think it's something that the government could stand to do better at. But actually, I think a lot of that work actually does lie with businesses who are doing a good job at playing catch up, of trying to work out how to protect, for instance, data and that kind of thing.
Okay, Anne says there should not be a party political divide on this. For society to function, there needs to be a fair and effective justice system. Sentences are relevant if the system is failing. Do we think that this is something that our parties are going to cotton on to, or are we constantly embroiled in political divides no matter what the topic is?
I think there's always going to be a political divide on this issue. I mean, there's always sort of a competition to appear toughest on crime. So, you know, I think whether we think there should be or not, there is always going to be politics involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you approach it with different ethical axioms, you come up with a different idea of what justice looks like. So people are always going to be arguing about this. I don't think we'll ever reach a sort of a happy state where everyone agrees that we found the perfect system.
I think that's probably right. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to invite you to give some final thoughts. If you have anything you didn't get to say you wanted to touch on, and I'm going to look through see if there's a few more questions we might be able to answer. So if anyone has anything that they particularly want to bring up, please do.
I think I've covered most of it. I guess the one thing I would sort of add as well is it's just coming back to this idea that I really do want to emphasize the need to improve the state of the prison system, and just to be able to treat prisoners with the dignity that they deserve as human beings. The fact that we believe that they're dangerous or that they've done something wrong and they should therefore be off the streets doesn't, to me, sort of remove our responsibility to make sure that they're sort of safe and cared for within the prison system.
I also, before we finish, I have to give right of question to my boss, Eamon Butler. He always gets a question, and he submitted 2, but I'll just pick one. It was alluded to earlier, Hannah. You alluded to the idea that we might be facing some legal challenges to this. He said it took 10 years of legal arguments before kettling was finally judged to be legal. Do you expect another 10 years of court cases over what counts as too much noise or public nuisance and other sort of vague issues? Or are we going to stamp out the vagueness of the legislation through amendments?
I think, you know, elements of this probably will be tested in court. I think, you know, as we said, there's a lot of human rights organisations. It's not individuals, it's big organisations that are opposing this, who, you know, tend to like an odd the odd court battle. So I think there will be parts of this that do end up being hashed out by judges eventually. But as you say, this can take a very, very long time. So I don't think we'll see the result of that anytime soon.
Another question. We have one from John. Do you think there's a political willpower to reform prisons? We seem to be very unsympathetic to prisoners and offenders in this country. Do we think that it will ever come about, or if the Tories will just continue to let it slide while focusing on sentencing and increasing police presence?
I mean, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect the reason that the Conservative Party in particular has kind of been fairly slow on this is that it's been very, as you say, cost obsessed over the last decade now, actually, even when it really shouldn't be at times. And particularly, you know, coming into this year with Sunak sort of already looking to push forward tax increases in the near-term future at the point when you should really still be pushing for more stimulus. I think the way to kind of get yourself political room on this is to present it as a sort of joint package, which is to say, look, these people are going to be in jail for longer. We're going to refund the court system, the police system, to make sure the crimes are detected, caught, and punished, and that the sentence will be commensurate to make sure that the public is kept safe. I think if you kind of present it as a combined package, there is probably support for it in a way which will avoid the sort of the Daily Mail, the Sun headlines about prisoners with TVs in their cells, whatever the latest outrage is.
Yeah,
I think. Go ahead, Anita.
No, I was just going to add that actually there are more. Michael Gove, for instance, former Lord Chancellor, you know, he had a big thing about, you know, I talked about these problem-solving courts. That was a big thing that he supported, that's been found to work in other countries across the world. And he pushed that a lot when he was Justice Secretary back in 2016, around 2015, 2016. And I think that there are more people who are asking questions about how you rehabilitate, how you really reduce recidivism, which is a massive problem in this country, as well as considering how you reduce a broader prison population, for instance. So I think you'd find an unusual alliance of Conservative ministers and MPs who have an interest in considering whether or not the current status quo works. Whether that manifests itself in quite that way, I'm not so sure. And I think the point about cost constraints is an important one. And that's one of the reasons why I think reoffending and reducing reoffending is possibly the way that the Conservative Party engages in trying to unpick that dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really good point there as well, which is that we have a lot of people kind of go into prison on these short-term sentences, which not only don't really seem to rehabilitate, but also actively, possibly at least, seem to increase the possibility of reoffending. So there are people in the prison system who are kind of coming in and out these short-term sentences who really shouldn't be there and who need other forms of support, whereas there are other people kind of being let out who should be in there significantly longer because they're still dangerous.
But that's not a new problem. I mean, these shorter sentences, I mean, I don't really know what my point is there, but I think what I'm trying to say is that you know, a lot of these issues around prisons have been there for a long time, and there doesn't seem to have been the political will so far to tackle those. It's not a vote winner. So you know, I hope it's something that there will be the political will to tackle, but it seems like that hasn't been as of yet, and I don't know what would have to change for that to happen.
Well,
yeah,
I think
that's a fair point.
Yeah, I think the vote is, if it hasn't already happened, is about to happen. What do we think the numbers are going to be? Do we have a any assessment?
I think it'll split pretty much down party lines. I don't think it'll deviate that much from that, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there'll actually be many, if any, Conservative rebellions on second reading. But why rebel at this point? They support the broader principles of the bill.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. One of our final questions comes from Jonathan. Do you think there'll be rebellion later on, at a later stage?
I think it partly depends, annoyingly, on whether or not the COVID restrictions get lifted as quickly as the Conservative backbenchers hope. And I think, again, a cleverly worded Lord's amendment might see the rebels kind of rally behind that and try to get the government to accept it. At this stage, I think it's more unlikely than likely.
Great. Well, I think at that, we will draw this to a close. Thank you so much for all of your comments. And thank you for all of our attendees for sending great questions. We have another webinar next week featuring my boss, Madsen Piri. So join us at Tuesday, 6 p.m. Thank you.
Yes.